terms of projects, it's difficult to say which one is actually going to come online. What you have across the continent now is a huge rush of developers, in my view, that have great ideas, have come up with very opportunistic sources. So some places people are focusing on solar, some people are focusing on coal, fuel oil, et cetera, right, in terms of power. And you never know what's actually going to happen in terms of what's going to close. There's so many factors that can impact the ability to close out on the pipeline. It's hard to say this one's definitely going to happen versus this one. You see a lot of key projects, I would say, huge projects, big names behind them, et cetera. You also see a lot of smaller or medium-sized projects. Also, I think the smaller and medium-sized projects are the ones that have the greatest opportunity of happening. The big ones just take a large amount of stakeholder alignment. So, just getting back to the original question, hard to say what's actually coming online. I would just say you see a diverse array of projects across, say, the top 20 or 30 economies on the continent. In terms of what's driving it, I wouldn't say a sector as much as just demand by the population for power. There's not a huge industrial base in most countries across the continent. Some of the major countries, yes, but you still have most of the continent dependent on agriculture. So it's hard to say a sector's driving it, but you do see this pent-up demand for power, where it's becoming much more prominent. I think a large amount of that is being driven by aid organizations, World Bank, IMF, trying to help countries get the power situation corrected, whichever respective country. So I think that's driving it. I also think politicians are also stepping up and trying to reduce the dependency on the legacy projects that have been put in before. There's a lot of hydro on the continent that's been around for like 50 years and can no longer operate to the extent that it could. So I think the politicians are really driving it, which is great. And I also think, like I said, you see the population demanding power. Operating on diesel gen sets for 24 hours a day is expensive, or even using candlelight is even more expensive. So you do see the huge demand from the population also. So the first thing I ask is, what's the tariff? It's first. Two, who's the off-taker? So at the end of the day, for IPPs, off-taker is either utility or, if you have a government guarantee, government. That's extremely important for lenders. Then the CapEx cost, right? So you typically do a trade-off. A lot of times you'll say $1.2 to $1.5 million for some technologies, $2 million per megawatt for other technologies. So you try to benchmark the CapEx costs. And then you try to look at the country itself in terms of, where are you actually going to put the power project? If it's in a location where there will be no land access rights, et cetera, or it's violent, there's a less likelihood that you'll be able to own that project for 20 years continuously without disruption. So I would say those are the four key things that I look at. So I actually think it's helping in many parts of the continent. So, places like Angola, Nigeria, it's obviously punishing them. Ghana to a certain extent because they're trying to increase their production. But the large oil producers, obviously it's lowering the amount of dollars they have in their coffers, and then that means it's harder to import equipment and pay for power, et cetera. But if you look at other economies that are not dependent on oil exports, but are more dependent on oil imports, it's giving them a bit more buffer, because now you've taken down a key cost for the government in terms of oil imports. So I would say, for the oil producers, negative impact. A lot of infrastructure projects shelved in both Nigeria and Angola, from what we've seen. And they've tried to focus on the oil producing sector, so that means everything outside of that just gets less money allocated to it. But in the other economies, I wouldn't say the oil's had an impact. I don't think it's improved it, but I don't think it's had an impact. If anything, it's given them a little bit more buffer. It's just right now the global economy, there's so much uncertainty. To me, the biggest impact on infrastructure projects is really just Forex. Right now, most emerging market economies, especially African economies, have dropped considerably compared to the dollar. I think that's impacting the development of sustainable infrastructure projects much more than the oil price. You're seeing a lot more tools and creativity to get around the unbankability of some of the governments. Like some governments, Forex is an issue. Some governments, reaching their debt ceiling is an issue. So you'll see things like World Bank using partial risk guarantees from the World Bank, which has helped out some projects. You see quite a few more sort of multilaterals stepping in to projects, whether it's debt, whether it's equity and different equity instruments. You're seeing a lot more multilateral or bilateral institutions helping with development. So you see a lot of USAID has a development tool that people could use to get support from folks that could help them from the US to develop projects. I think DBSA has come out with a development facility. So there's quite a few more options for project developers now, largely driven, I think, by sort of multilaterals or bilaterals. In terms of stakeholder involvement, I think the governments they have to actively get involved because it's IPP or road project, et cetera, and they're trying to find ways to give a bit more security to developers. Trying to, for instance, I look at Kenya, and one priority for Kenya is geothermal power projects. And what they did, which I thought was clever, really great idea, for geothermal, a huge amount of the cost and uncertainty come down to exploration of trying to find a source that allows you to gather the power, get the power that you need to really produce. And the Kenyan government set up an organization called the GDC to take the development or the exploration risk away from developers. So in other words, they'll go sort of dig, they'll go find a good source for geothermal, and they'll bid out the project for whoever wants to purchase it. So, what does that do? It takes away a key amount of risk, puts it into one institution that builds up the expertise for exploration, and then also lowers the tariff on the back end because now you've significantly de-risked the project for developers. So we're starting to see a lot more creative programs, creative structures, institutions set up specifically to manage this. South Africa's done a great job with Renewable Energy Power Project program. So I think there's quite a few things you see from multiple stakeholders that are trying to de-risk projects. In terms of debt to equity, I think that largely depends on the commercial circumstances and how willing people are to be creative when it comes to project finance. If a bank doesn't want to be creative and they say it's 70-30 regardless, that's different from a bank that will say, all right, let's look at the project cash flows or projected project cash flows and maybe we could do 80-20, et cetera. So we do sort of see a all hands on deck approach, I would say, from private institutions to public institutions to multilaterals, et cetera, to try to advance the development of projects in the region.